The first light over the Yamuna is soft and unsure, as if the sun itself is pausing before it dares to touch the white dome rising from the mist. Dew clings to the grass, to the sandals of the lone caretaker walking along the long, empty marble platform. His fingers trail across the cold stone, tracing veins in the rock that was carved, carried, and set here 4 centuries ago. Above him, the Taj Mahal glows faintly, not yet the blazing icon of postcards and pilgrim selfies, but a quiet, pale ghost in the half-light. Behind that silence, there are sounds no one hears anymore. The grunt of oxen dragging blocks of marble, the hammer's ring on chisel, the shouted orders in Persian and Hindavi, the sigh of the river bearing sand, timber, men. Beneath the perfect symmetry of arches and minarets lies another memory, the crack of muskets over Panipat, the shriek of horses at Kanwa, the roar of cannons outside Delhi's shattered gates. Marble and fire, side by side, like 2 hands clasped in uneasy prayer. Tonight we step back into that world of emperors who arrived as conquerors and stayed to crown a subcontinent in stone and blood. We will walk beside a homesick prince from the mountains, a child emperor building a new idea of rule, lovers whose grief hardened into architecture, and a ruler so devout and so hard that even his victories tasted like ash. The Mughal Empire is not just dates in a textbook. It is dust in the lungs, sweat on the brow, prayers in crowded mosques, and the echo of footsteps in abandoned forts. This is the story of how strangers from the north carved their names into the heart of India, and how, in the end, their own empire slipped through their fingers like sand. If you wish to keep journeying through these forgotten halls of marble and smoke, walk with us. Like the video, subscribe, and let the story keep breathing. Babur's shadow over the plains. The air in Fergana is thin and sharp, the kind that bites the lungs and reddens the cheeks. Babur remembers that air the way an old soldier remembers his first wound. In his mind, the mountains are always blue and white, blades of stone cutting into a sky so clear it almost hurts to look at. He remembers rivers that run cold and fast, flashing like steel as they tumble over rocks. He remembers orchards, the smell of damp soil and ripening fruit, the laughter of boys racing horses under the watchful eyes of men in fur-lined caps. He remembers, most of all, belonging. Now, as he sits by the dim glow of an oil lamp in a worn tent on the edge of an Indian plain, that memory feels like a story he once heard about someone else. The air here is heavy and wet, full of buzzing insects and the faint scent of smoke from a distant village. The canvas walls twitch gently in the night breeze. Somewhere in the darkness, a horse snorts and stamps. Armor clinks as a sentry shifts his weight. Babur bends over a sheet of paper, brush in hand, his shadow swaying across the rough ground. He writes of loss, of hope, of the strange lands he has crossed, and of the land that now lies ahead of him, Hindustan. At times, he mutters softly in Chagatai Turkic, the words meant for no one but himself, I wonder if fate has any mercy at all. No one in the camp can hear the sentence, but they feel the weight of his decisions. These men have followed him through defeats and narrow escapes, from the highlands of Central Asia to the stone walls of Kabul, and now down into this hot, crowded, unfamiliar world. They doze on their cloaks, curled around swords and matchlocks, the smell of sweat and oiled metal clinging to them. A few gamblers hunch over a scrap of cloth, throwing knuckle bones under a tiny lantern, their whispers rising and falling like the rustle of dry grass. Babur lifts his head and listens. Somewhere far away, a jackal calls. The night presses in. Tomorrow, or the day after that, he will have to decide how to claw an empire out of this vast plain. He had not always been a wandering prince. At 12, he had been king, or so they called him. Fergana had been his inheritance, a small valley, a fragment of the old Timurid world, where every uncle, cousin, and rival believed they deserved more than they had. The throne was a seat with knives hidden under the cushions. One day he was riding out at the head of a small army, his standard fluttering bravely in the cold wind. The next, He was scrambling over mountain passes, his followers scattered, his banner trampled in the snow. He learned early that thrones made of silk and gold could dissolve overnight, that loyalty was a coin often spent twice, that the blood of Timur in his veins might stir respect in some, jealousy in many, and mercy in almost none. He also learned something else: he could survive. Babur's hands, now stained with ink, had also known the weight of a sword, the recoil of a matchlock, the rough grip of reins held through ice and dust and rain. He had lost Samarkand, won it, lost it. Again, each time he had written it all down in his diary: victories, humiliations, even the shape of a good melon, the layout of a pleasant garden, the exact shade of a city's walls at sunset. In a world of shifting ground, his words became the only firm soil he could claim. Kabul had been his turning point. In the mountain city, with its crowded bazaars and tight, winding streets, he found something like a base. From its gates, he could look both north toward the lands he had lost and south toward the lands he did not yet know. Traders from India passed through with their bright cottons and strange spices, their talk full of stories, of rich cities where gold changed hands in crowded markets, of kings weighed down by jewels, of elephants armored in iron. Hindustan, they said, was a place where fortunes could be made in a single campaign. But stories also carried warnings. The heat was crushing, the monsoon rains a muddy fury. There were more people than a man could imagine, more tongues than one could count, more rival chiefs and sultans than stars in the sky. It was not a land you simply walked into and claimed. It was a sea that could swallow you whole. Still, Babur had begun to look south more often. His north had rejected him again and again. The lands of his ancestors had become a doorway that kept slamming in his face. If he wanted to be more than a footnote in a fading Timurid chronicle, he would need to carve his name somewhere else. Tonight, the map spread before him in the tent is stained at the edges, curled from use. A rough line marks the river that the locals call Yamuna. Beyond it lies Delhi, seat of Sultan Ibrahim Lodi. A heavy, suspicious man, the traders had said, surrounded by quarreling nobles and commanders who did not fully trust him. His elephants were powerful, yes, towering beasts with tusks capped in iron and armor embroidered with gold. But his court was divided, his rule shaky. A soft rustle at the entrance of the tent pulls Babur from his thoughts. A guard draws back the flap, bowing slightly as one of the senior commanders steps in, the smell of the night following him. Dust, smoke, sweat, the faint sweetness of trampled grass. Padishah, the man says, using the imperial title naturally, as if it were already beyond doubt, the scouts have returned. They say Lodi's army is near Panipat, many elephants, many men, they are making ready. Babur's eyes narrow, the lamplight catching the lines of fatigue on his face. For a moment, he is silent. The sounds of the camp leak in around them. A cough here, a murmur there, the distant ring of a hammer on metal as someone adjusts a stirrup or a buckle. How many? Babur asks. Some say 100,000 men, perhaps more, 300 war elephants. The numbers hang in the air like a thick fog. Against that, Babur has perhaps 12,000 soldiers, but his men are seasoned. They have marched over mountains, slept in snow and sand, eaten thin stew and gone on fighting. They have with them Turkish matchlockmen and artillery, strange thunder weapons that bark fire and smoke, tearing through flesh and fear alike. Babur looks back at his map. The plains around Panipat are open. If he can place his cannons well, if he can chain his wagons into a barrier, if he can force the enemy elephants into narrow killing fields, then perhaps numbers will matter less than discipline and planning. Elephants, he says at last, almost to himself. They will frighten some of our men, but they bleed too. The commander shifts on his feet. Shall we prepare the artillery lines, Padishah? Babur nods slowly. Yes, we will meet Ibrahim at Panipat. Tell the men, tomorrow we move. And tonight, let those who wish to pray, pray. Those who wish to sharpen their blades, sharpen. Dawn comes quickly on a day a man may die. When the commander leaves, the tent grows quiet again. Babur sits back and for a moment lets his head rest against the central pole, eyes closed. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he sees two worlds, the cold blue peaks of Fergana and the flat, hazy horizon of Hindustan's plain. "What have you done, Zahiruddin?" he whispers to himself, chasing shadows again. But even as he asks, he knows the answer. He cannot go back. There is no throne waiting for him in Samarkand, no quiet valley where he can retire as a harmless prince. The path forward runs through Panipat, through gunfire and dust, through the clash of a new kind of war against an old kind of power. Outside, the first pale streaks of dawn are already touching the edge of the sky. Somewhere, a rooster crows, confused by the soft brightening. The camp begins to stir. A cough here, a muttered joke there, the clatter of a pot, the crackle of a rekindled fire. A man hums a low tune from the mountains, carried to this distant plain by stubborn memory. Babur dips his brush once more and writes a final line for the night, the characters looping neatly across the page. Then he blows gently. To dry the ink, rolls up the paper and ties it with a careful hand. Whatever tomorrow brings, glory, disaster, or something between, history will know he was here. He steps out of the tent. The air is cooler than it will be in a few hours, carrying the damp smell of earth and horse. In the east, the sky is the color of steel just before it is plunged into the forge. Babur lifts his face to that thin light and breathes in, tasting dust, fear, and possibility all at once. Ahead, somewhere beyond the gray horizon, Ibrahim Lodi's elephants shift in their pickets, restless, sensing a storm. The plain between them waits like a held breath. At Panipat, the earth itself seemed to tense. When Babur's army reached the flat, open ground, the horizon was a low, gray line, broken only by scattered trees and distant smudges where villages clung to the edge of fields. The sky was a wide, pale bowl, empty but for a few slow birds circling high above, as if they were already waiting for what would be left behind. Babur rode out along the front, his horse's hooves kicking up small puffs of dust. Beside him trundled the cannons, short, squat tubes of metal dragged by oxen, their wheels creaking, their barrels wrapped with cloth against the morning damp. Men on foot moved alongside them, matchlock men with their strange, heavy guns and coils of slow-burning match cord draped over their shoulders like snakes. Artillerymen shouted to each other as they unlocked wagons and began to nudge them into place. "Here," Babur said, pointing with his riding whip. "Anchor the line from this tree to that rise. Chain the wagons together. Make it a wall of wood and iron." The orders spread quickly. Wheels groaned as the wagons were pulled nose to tail, then lashed with thick chains. Behind them, small gaps were left for the cavalry to pour through at the right moment. In front, trenches were dug in frantic, sweating strokes. The earth smelled rich and damp as spades bit into it. Men wiped mud from their brows, their breaths short and sharp in the cool air. To many of Babur's soldiers, this was not how a battle should look. Where were the grand open charges, the roaring waves of horsemen sweeping across the plain? Instead, they were building a fence, like farmers trying to keep out wolves. Some muttered under their breath. A few glanced at the cannons with mistrust, as if the weapons themselves were demons in metal skins. Babur noticed. Pulling his horse up near a cluster of uneasy men, he lifted his voice so it carried across the clamor. "You have fought with me in the mountains," he called. "You have seen me lead from the front. I do not hide behind walls, but today this wall will be our sword." The men looked up, some straightened, a few grinned despite themselves. He pointed out toward the hazy distance. "Ibrahim comes with more men than we can count, with elephants taller than our tents. If we meet them in the open, they will crush us under their feet. So we will not give them the open. We will make the plain narrow. We will make their elephants fear the sound of our guns." A murmur of rough laughter ran through the line. Fear did not vanish, but it bent. It took a shape they could understand. By the time the sun had climbed higher, a fortress of wagons and earthworks stood on the plain. Between the chained carts, small windows gaped, places for the cannons to speak, for the matchlock barrels to peer out, dark and waiting. Behind them, cavalry squadrons shifted patiently, their horses snorting, stamping, tossing their heads as the scent of disturbed earth and nervous sweat filled the air. Then the scouts rode in, cloaks flapping, faces streaked with dust. One raised an arm and pointed. "They are coming." At first it was only a smudge on the horizon. Then the smudge grew teeth, glints of metal, the wobbling tips of standards, the slow, rolling mass of an army. The earth began to tremble very softly, like a drumskin touched by a cautious hand. Soon the mutter of distant voices came with the wind, mixed with the harsh cry of elephants. From Babur's vantage point, Ibrahim Lodi's host seemed to stretch sideways without end, a great uneven wave of men and beasts. Elephants lumbered at the front, their backs covered with howdahs where archers and musketmen perched. Their trunks swung, their ears flapped, their small eyes glinted above tusks wrapped in metal. Amid them marched dense blocks of infantry, shields glinting, spears and swords held steady. Babur felt the familiar tightening in his chest, a twist of fear, yes, but also of something else. This was the moment his wandering life had been stepping toward, one uncertain mile at a time. Every campfire, every lost city, every cold night in the mountains had led him here. He lowered his visor and raised his hand, a signal. Along his line, cannons were loaded. Powder was poured, wadding rammed, shots shoved into the waiting mouths of metal. Matchlock men checked their cords, the orange glow at tips steady and hungry. The air thickened with the bitter, smoky smell of gunpowder even before the first shot was fired. The enemy came closer. The elephants' bells chimed faintly, bright little sounds that did not match the weight of the animals. Drums thudded, voices shouted, standards shook in the busy air. Babur's grip tightened on his reins. "Not yet," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. He wanted them close, close enough that the cannon's roar would tear holes in their front ranks, close enough that the elephant's courage would buckle when iron crashed into flesh. Closer. Closer. Now. The first cannon fired with a deafening crack. The sound slammed into the chests of Babur's men. Birds leapt from trees in a terrified rush. A plume of smoke burst from the wagon line, drifting sideways as the next cannon boomed, and then the next. The plain, moments ago a stage of slow, steady movement, exploded into chaos. Iron shot tore through the front of Ibrahim's army. Men fell. An elephant screamed as a ball smashed into its leg, sending it crashing to the ground. Blood and dust mingled, the air suddenly thick with the reek of burning powder and hot flesh. Matchlocks spat fire from behind the wagons, their reports sharp and harsh. Arquebus balls punched through armor, shields, and the soft bodies behind them. The elephants, wounded and panicked by noise they did not understand, began to flinch, rear, and veer sideways. Some turned and stumbled back into their own ranks, trampling men under their massive feet. Commands shouted in Ibrahim's camp were swallowed by the roar. Babur watched for the sign, the moment when the great host in front of him shifted from a tight fist to a loose, shaking hand. "There," he said quietly, seeing gaps opening, lines bending. He raised his arm again, this time toward the waiting cavalry. "Now, break them." From behind the wagon line, like water bursting from a dam, Babur's horsemen poured out through the prepared gaps. They fanned to the flanks, not charging straight into the crushing center, but biting at the sides where the enemy was confused and exposed. Hooves thundered on the hard-packed earth. Bows creaked. Arrows hissed into the thick of men struggling to hold formation. Swords flashed in the smoky light. On the other side, Ibrahim Lodi tried to rally his army. Envoys had once described him as a man of strength, but strength can turn to stubbornness, and stubbornness can turn to blindness. He believed numbers alone would carry the day. He urged his men onward, called to his commanders, pushed more forces into the narrowing space where Babur's guns and trenches had forced them to stand. But the more he crowded the plain, the more the killing ground filled. The battle stretched hour after crushing hour. The sun climbed overhead, blazing down on iron helmets and sweating faces. Powder smoke hung low over the field, stinging eyes and throats. Men slipped on blood-slicked ground, their sandals and boots soaked red. Elephants, enraged and terrified, rampaged through friend and foe alike, trumpeting their pain into the hot, unforgiving sky. In the midst of it all, Babur moved along his line, shouting praise, giving orders, steadying those whose courage wavered. Dust stuck to his face, sweat ran down his neck, but his voice stayed clear. Hold the line, reload. Aim low, the beasts are tall, but their legs are their weakness. By mid-afternoon, the shape of the battle was clear. Ibrahim's grand army, wrecked against wood, iron, and thunder, began to splinter. Standards fell. Groups of soldiers threw away their weapons and ran, their feet kicking up little clouds of dust that quickly blew away. Others fought on out of habit, swinging dull, exhausted blows until they too dropped. When word spread, true or embellished, that Ibrahim Lodi himself had fallen, the last thread holding his army together snapped. The field became a scattering of survivors fleeing in every direction. Only then did Babur allow himself to breathe. He pulled off his helmet, the metal hot against his skin, and wiped a sleeve across his forehead. The noise of battle was fading, replaced by groans, the snorting of injured horses, the low mutter of men searching for friends among the bodies. The clouds of smoke drifted away in ragged streaks, revealing what they had hidden, the ground covered with the dead. For a long moment Babur simply looked. Victory lay before him, yes, but it lay in pieces. Each lifeless face, each broken weapon, was a word in the sentence he had just written across this plain. One of his officers rode up, stopping a short distance away out of respect. "Padishah," he said, his voice hoarse, "the day is ours. Hindustan is open." Babur nodded slowly, but his heart felt heavy, as if someone had tied a stone to it. He thought of his ancestors, of Timur's blazing conquests, of Samarkand's blue-tiled domes. He thought of the small boy in Fergana, clinging to a throne built over a shaki. "And earth. I have seen much ruin to gain this," he murmured. That night back in his tent, he unrolled new sheets of paper. His hand ached, his body ached, but he wrote line after tireless line about the battle, the positions, the tactics, the numbers, the way the elephants had broken and scattered. His words were calm, almost clinical, yet between them, like ink he could not quite wash away, lay his doubts. In the days that followed, Babur entered Delhi. The city received him not with joy, but with a kind of wary acceptance. One king had fallen, another now rode through the gates. The streets smelled of dust, spices, sweat, and old fear. Crows watched from rooftops. Some people bowed as he passed. Others stared without expression, already weighing this new ruler, wondering what his reign would bring, justice or just another wave of taxes and war. In the palaces, he found jewels, silks, and treasures taken from those before him. He also found responsibility, a weight that settled on his shoulders every time a petition was brought, every time a dispute was laid before his judges. He had won a kingdom in a single day of fire. But how long could a kingdom won by strangers survive in a land so vast, so deep-rooted in its own ways? On some evenings, the heat of Hindustan pressed in so hard it felt like a hand on his throat. Babur would climb to high terraces, seeking a breath of cooler air. He would look at the sky and imagine, for a moment, the sharper blue of Fergana. In his memoirs, he would later complain about the climate, the lack of clear-running streams, the strange fruits and plants. Yet even as he complained, fate had already begun to weave his line into the soil. Somewhere in the future, a grandson he would never meet was waiting to be born. A child who would not remember Fergana, who would not call himself a stranger in Hindustan, but who would try to build an empire that could include both the conqueror and the conquered. Babur could not see that far. He only knew that his wandering feet had, at last, come to rest upon a throne. He stood between the memories of the mountains and the noise of the crowded plains, unsure if he had truly found a home or merely a larger battlefield. And all the while, beyond palace walls, India continued to breathe in its own rhythm, temple bells ringing at dusk, muezzins calling at dawn, merchants shouting prices in the markets. An old land had accepted a new master, but it would not bend easily. Somewhere in those restless streets, the future of the Mughal Empire was already stirring, quiet as a child's first breath. Akbar's dream of an impossible empire. The child who would inherit Babur's fragile kingdom was not born under a clear sky or in a peaceful palace. The story moves forward through a haze of battles, hurried marches, and uneasy camps. Humayun, Babur's son, tried to hold the empire together with hands that were brave but often uncertain. He lost what his father had gained, won it back, only to lose himself in the swirl of chance and exile. By the time Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar came into the world in 1542, his family's claim to Hindustan was as fragile as a candle flame in the wind. Akbar was born not in a grand fort, but in the rugged loneliness of Umarkot in Sindh, under the shelter of a local Hindu ruler who gave refuge to his wandering parents. The air was dry, smelling of dust and scrub plants, the wind whistling over low walls. Inside a modest chamber, Humayun paced like a restless shadow, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on a door that refused to open quickly enough. At last a midwife appeared, her face lined with fatigue but softened by a small, tired smile. "A son, sire," she whispered. Humayun's shoulders sagged with relief. He stepped forward, hands trembling slightly as he took the tiny, swaddled bundle. The baby's fist was closed, his face scrunched, his first cry a thin, angry protest against the harshness of the world he had entered. Humayun pressed his lips to the child's forehead. "Jalaluddin Muhammad," he murmured, "may your glory be greater than your father's." Outside, the desert wind rattled dry leaves against the walls. No one present could have guessed that this small child, born to a father in exile, would become the greatest emperor of their line. Akbar's early years were a blur of movement. He grew up in tents, forts, and borrowed halls, surrounded by men who woke to the clatter of arms and slept with swords within reach. Instead of books, he learned the language of horses and steel. He watched soldiers strap on armor, listened to commanders argue over maps, smelled the acrid sting of gunpowder as cannons were tested. He did not learn to read, but he learned to remember. Faces, loyalties, small details of who had stood firm and who had flinched. These became his letters, his words, his sentences. When Humayun finally regained Delhi with Persian help, the victory was brief. One day, as he descended the steps of his library, his foot caught on the edge of his robe. In a single, cruel heartbeat, the emperor fell, his head striking stone. The echo of that fall rang through the halls, through the city, through the bones of a 13-year-old boy who suddenly found the weight of an empire placed upon his narrow shoulders. On a hot day in 1556 in the fort at Kallanur, Akbar was brought to a raised platform under the open sky. The air shimmered with heat. Sweat trickled down the necks of courtiers standing in stiff rows. A canopy cast a trembling patch of shade over the simple seat that had been prepared. This was no grand marble throne, just a symbol hastily arranged, because history rarely waits for perfect settings. Bahram Khan, the powerful regent who had guided Humayun's return, stood close by, his face stern, his beard flecked with white. He watched as the child stepped up, his eyes dark and wide, his movements careful but not timid. Akbar sat back straight, legs barely long enough to reach the floor. As the royal titles were proclaimed, drums boomed and elephants trumpeted from below, their calls rolling over the walls like waves. In that moment, the empire was both greater and weaker than it had ever been. Greater, because it now carried the echo of 2 generations of struggle. Weaker, because it was tied to the fate of a boy barely old enough to wield a sword, much less command a continent. Akbar's first taste of rule was not marble halls and leisurely councils. It was the harsh reality of survival. Only months after his coronation, a new threat loomed. Hemu, a skilled Hindu general serving the Afghan Sur remnants, swept across northern India, defeating Mughal forces, claiming Delhi and taking the title of King Vikramaditya. His armies were disciplined, his ambition sharp. Once again, all that Babur had won and Humayun had reclaimed seemed on the edge of slipping away. On the plain of Panipat, on ground stained already by Babur's great gamble, the stage was set for another decisive battle. Fog hung low that morning, a gray veil over the field. The smell of damp earth filled the air. Horses snorted uneasily, their flanks steaming in the chill. Akbar, still only a teenager, watched as his commanders prepared the lines, as cannons were positioned, as matchlock men checked their cords. Bahram Khan kept the boy emperor behind the main clash, sheltered but watching. Akbar's fingers curled around the hilt of his sword, knuckles white. His heart hammered as he heard the first boom of the cannons, saw shadows moving in the mist, then the sudden chaos of clashing steel and surging men. When the fog lifted and the dust settled, the Mughal army had carried the day. Hemu lay fallen, struck in the eye by an arrow, dragged from his elephant and cut down. The story told in later years said that Akbar, urged by his regent, laid his hand to the defeated king's body to claim the final act of victory. Whether the boy truly struck the blow or not, one thing was clear: a fragile empire had survived another mortal threat. But survival was not enough. Akbar, as he grew, began to see that holding Hindustan would require something more than victories. It would require a different way of ruling. The land he inherited was a woven tapestry of beliefs, languages, and loyalties. Afghan chiefs guarded their own power. Rajput rulers watched from their hill forts with narrowed eyes, and old Muslim elites measured the young emperor against their memories of his grandfather. Rivers wound through cities where temple bells rang at dawn and muezzins called at dusk, their sounds overlapping in the warm evening air. One night, as the camp lay quiet under a quilt of stars, Akbar walked alone between rows of sleeping tents. The air smelled of ash from dying fires and the faint sweetness of crushed grass. He paused near the edge, where the land stretched out, flat and dark. How do you rule a place like this? He wondered aloud. By fear, by faith, by something else? The only answer was the distant bark of a dog and the wind sighing in the tall grass. Yet in his silence, a decision was forming, one that would change the shape of the Mughal Empire more than any single battle. Akbar's adolescence unfolded not in the quiet safety of palace gardens but in the restless world beyond their walls, a world where alliances were fragile, rebellions flared like dry grass fires, and every decision could tilt the balance of the empire. Yet as he grew into his role, the awkward stiffness of childhood melted away. The young emperor's shoulders straightened, his stride lengthened, his voice gained weight, not merely by volume but by certainty. Those who served him began to sense something unusual. This was a ruler who watched everything, forgot nothing, and feared little. In his early 20s, Akbar made a choice that startled his advisors. He dismissed Bahram Khan, the regent who had guided him since childhood. Some claimed it was a reckless act of pride, others aired that Akbar had simply grown tired of ruling from behind another man's shadow. But for Akbar, this was necessary, not an act of rebellion, but of becoming. He summoned Bahram Khan privately. The chamber was dim, lit only by a few oil lamps that cast soft pools of gold on the carpet. Dust motes drifted lazily in their glow. Bahram, tall and still proud despite the years, bowed his head. "Shahenshah," he said calmly, "you no longer need a guardian. You have become what your father hoped." Akbar's voice was quiet but firm. "You taught me well. For that I will always honor you. But an emperor must stand alone." The words hung between them, final, heavy, but not cruel. Bahram Khan accepted exile with dignity, departing on pilgrimage. Akbar, watching him ride out from the fort gates, felt both sorrow and relief. Of his life had closed, another now opened. With full authority in his hands, Akbar turned his gaze toward the great patchwork of kingdoms that dotted the subcontinent. The Rajputs, proud and fiercely independent, were among the most formidable. Their hill forts rose from the earth like the ribs of ancient beasts. Their warriors rode under banners that fluttered like flame. Many Muslim rulers before Akbar had clashed with them, seeking submission through force. Akbar, however, chose a different blade, one forged of diplomacy rather than iron. He sent envoys, not armies. He offered alliances, not ultimatums. And most daring of all, he sought to bind his house to theirs through marriage. When news spread that Akbar would wed a Rajput princess, Harkabai, later known as Maryam-uz-Zamani, murmurs rippled through both courts. Critics sneered, orthodox clerics grumbled, and some whispered that a Mughal emperor had bowed his head too low. Akbar ignored them. On the day of the wedding, the palace in amber glowed under garlands of marigolds and jasmine. Drums echoed off red sandstone walls. Elephants draped in embroidered cloth swayed gently as lanterns flickered in the dusk. In the women's quarters, the bride's bangles chimed softly as she was adorned, the scent of sandalwood heavy in the air. The marriage did more than unite two individuals. It opened doors no emperor before had dared approach. Rajput chiefs who had once braced for war now found themselves welcomed in Akbar's court, granted high ranks, their honor protected. Trust, a delicate plant, began to take root. But Akbar's vision stretched far beyond marriage alliances. He wanted an empire not merely conquered, but cooperatively built, a place where different beliefs could coexist without tearing the throne apart. In the palace at Fatehpur Sikri, a city he would later build from the red dust of the earth, Akbar began experimenting with something unprecedented. He gathered scholars, poets, philosophers, and theologians from Hindu, Muslim, Jain, Sikh, and even Portuguese Christian traditions. These men, robed in their distinct colors and customs, sat together in the Ibadat Khana, the house of worship. The debates that followed were thunderous. A Brahmin scholar, face flushed with passion, declared, "Truth is one, but paths are many." A Sunni jurist retorted sharply, "The path of truth cannot be divided like the branches of a tree." A Jesuit priest lifted a polished crucifix and argued for salvation through a single savior. A Jain master spoke in calm tones about nonviolence as the highest law. Akbar sat among them, not as a ruler demanding obedience, but as a seeker listening, absorbing each word like a man gathering threads to weave into something new. The chamber often grew hot, bodies packed close, tempers rising with the temperature. Lamps flickered, shadows quivered against the carved walls, and sometimes a gust of wind carried the mingled scents of incense and sweat. But Akbar remained steady, his presence alone enough to cool tempers when arguments became too sharp. One evening, after a particularly intense debate, a Sufi poet approached him quietly. "Shahanshah," he said, bending his head, "you chase a dream larger than even your empire." Akbar looked at him, eyes soft but determined. "If we cannot live with understanding, then we will live in fear, and fear is no foundation for a kingdom." The poet smiled. "Your dream is impossible, but impossible dreams are the only ones worth pursuing." Akbar stepped outside into the cooler night. The sky above Fatehpur Sikri was vast and dark, filled with stars. The sandstone buildings glowed faintly, their surfaces still warm from the day's sun. From a nearby courtyard came the rhythmic thump of a drum, the low hum of voices, the laughter of guards sharing a last cup of water before sleep. He breathed deeply. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and the sweet smoke of incense drifting from a temple beyond the walls. This land, this sprawling, contradictory, magnificent land, was becoming his, and he was becoming part of it. But with every step forward, shadows stirred at the edges. Orthodox elements in his court read that he was meddling too much with religion. Some Rajputs trusted him, but others watched him with wary eyes. Afghan chiefs still dreamed of reclaiming their lost dominance. In the south, the Deccan Sultanate simmered with suspicion. Akbar felt the tension like the taut string of a bow. The slightest wrong move could send the arrow wildly off its intended path. Yet he pressed on. He abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, a gesture that stunned many and infuriated some. He appointed Hindus to high administrative posts, elevating them not as tokens but as partners. He introduced land reforms, reorganized revenue systems, and sent trusted officials to every corner of his domain to ensure corrupt governors could not bleed the people dry. Every reform deepened the empire's roots, and deepened the anger of those who believed tradition was crumbling. One afternoon, while riding through the outskirts of Agra, Akbar passed a group of children playing beside a dusty road. Their laughter rose into the warm air like birds in flight. A small girl, hair tied in a loose braid, stared openly at the emperor, unafraid. She held a clay pot, chipped and worn, and grinned at him as if he were simply another traveler. In that moment, Akbar's heart softened. He reined in his horse. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lalita," she said. "And what do you want to be when you grow up, Lalita?" She shrugged, happy. Her simple answer struck him harder than any court debate ever had. Happiness, not fear. Hope, not division. Perhaps this, he thought, is what an emperor must protect above all. But happiness is fragile, especially in a vast empire. And no dream, no matter how noble, is immune to the storms gathering in the distance. For while Akbar built bridges, others quietly gathered stones to break them. The Rajput kingdom of Mughal, proud and unyielding, refused alliance. Its ruler, Rana Pratap, rejected Akbar's overtures, vowing never to submit. Their clash would carve itself into the memory of the age and test the very foundations of Akbar's vision. The drums of war were beginning to pulse again, faint but steady, like thunder rolling far across the desert. The road to Mughal was made of dust, stone, and wounded pride. Akbar had bent many kingdoms into alliance, but Mughal stood apart, its refusal a small but stubborn thorn in the flesh of his empire. To Akbar, alliance with the Rajputs was a bridge toward unity. To Rana Pratap, ruler of Mughal, it was a chain he would not wear. In the hill fort of Kumbhogar, with its walls coiling over the ridges like a stone serpent, Rana Pratap vowed to keep his land free, even if it meant war against a power greater than any Mughal had ever faced. Messages went back and forth. Offers were made, honors proposed, promises of dignity and high rank laid out like fine cloth before a king. Each time, Rana Pratap refused. Akbar's patience thinned. The dream of a united empire could not endure too many exclusions. Gaps were cracks, and cracks spread. So the armies marched. On a morning in 1576, in a narrow valley called Haldighati, the hills watched as two worlds collided. The soil there, rich with turmeric, glowed a deep, strange yellow as if the earth itself had been brushed with gold. Mist clung to the slopes, slowly lifting as the sun began its climb. Rajput warriors took their positions, shields ready, lances firm, turbans bright against the pale haze. Among them was Rana Pratap, mounted on his famous horse, Chetak, a gray-blue stallion whose muscles rippled under his jeweled harness. Facing them stood the Mughal host, led by one of Akbar's most trusted commanders, Raja Man Singh of Amber, a Rajput in Mughal service, a living symbol of Akbar's vision and Rana Pratap's worst fear. Elephants stamped and shifted. Mughal cavalry drew long, curved swords. The air tasted of dust and anticipation. When the battle began, it was like a dam breaking. Rajput horsemen charged with a fierce, desperate courage, their war cries echoing against the cliffs. Steel clashed on steel, arrows hissed through the air. Chetak leapt forward, Rana Pratap's spear leveled as he drove straight toward the enemy command. For a moment, it seemed as if one man's will might pierce the entire Mughal line. But the Mughal army was large, disciplined, and supported by deadly firearms. As the sun burned higher, the turmeric-yellow earth turned red in patches. Haldighati filled with the sounds of men shouting, horses screaming, the dull, sickening thud of blows that found their mark. Chetak was wounded, some say by an elephant's tusk, others by a blade, but the stallion carried his master away from the thick of battle, muscles quivering, hooves pounding the stony path. Only when they had reached the safety of a shallow stream did the horse collapse, chest heaving, eyes dimming. Rana Pratap knelt beside the dying animal, his hand pressed to its sweat-slicked neck. "Forgive me," he whispered. The Mughal army held the field that day, by the Misu. Rays of generals and chroniclers, Haldighati was a Mughal victory. Yet Muir did not submit. Its forts, its people, its stubborn spirit endured, fighting on from the hills and forests for years to come. News of the battle reached Akbar amid the busy hum of imperial life. He studied the reports in quiet chambers that smelled of ink and rosewater, his fingers resting on the parchment as if he could feel the lives spent in each line. The empire had expanded again, but not fully. Another step toward unity, but not the final one. Still, his vision did not dim. In the heart of northern India, on a rocky ridge, he ordered a new city to rise, Fatehpur Sikri, the city of victory. Men arrived from all corners of the empire, stonecutters from Rajasthan, tile makers from Persia, calligraphers from Herat, carpenters from the Punjab. Under a relentless sun, hammers rang and chisels bit into blocks of red sandstone. Dust floated in the air like a fine veil, the scent of lime mortar mixed with sweat and wood shavings. Slowly from the bare ground, courtyards, palaces, mosques, and halls of audience emerged. Arches framed views of the surrounding valley. Jali's latticed stone screens filtered the harsh light into delicate patterns on the floor. The Bulan Darwaza, a towering gateway, rose like a giant's threshold, its steps so broad that 100 men could stand side by side. But Fatehpur Sikri was more than an architectural dream. It was also a monument to a promise. Nearby lived Sheikh Salim Kishti, a Sufi mystic whose prayers Akbar believed had blessed him with a long-awaited heir. The emperor, who had once walked barefoot to the sheikh's modest dwelling, now built a white marble tomb for him within the city, its walls gleaming softly amid the red stone. Pilgrims came there often, women desperate for children tied red threads to the carved windows. Men bowed their heads, lips moving in silent petitions. Akbar himself stood there sometimes in the quiet hours, hands folded, eyes distant. "An empire is like a child," he said once to a close aide. "It must be cared for, guided, protected, but in the end it will grow into something of its own." His own child, Prince Salim, grew in the shadow of Fatehpur Sikri's glowing walls, surrounded by luxury but also by expectation. The boy watched his father hold vast gatherings in the Diwan-i-Khas, the hall of private audience, where nobles debated policy and scholars discussed faith. He watched Akbar listen more than he spoke, his face calm, his gaze steady. Yet as Akbar's ideas grew more daring, hinting at a new spiritual order, at loyalty to the emperor as a unifying bond beyond religion, discomfort grew as well. Some accused him of abandoning Islam. Others whispered that he sought to make himself not just ruler but almost a prophet. The Din-i-Ilahi, his small, esoteric path of devotion and ethical living, was followed by few, understood by fewer, and resented by many. In the bazaars, rumors spread like smoke. In distant villages, people shrugged. Their lives were still measured more by harvests and local taxes than by debates in distant halls. But in the courts of rivals and in the hearts of those who clung to rigid lines, the seed of opposition sprouted. Over time, practical troubles began to gnaw at Fatehpur Sikri. Water grew scarce. The city, so grand and freshly built, began to feel like a beautiful garment that did not quite fit the body of the empire. Campaigns in the north and in the Deccan pulled Akbar away. The capital shifted back toward Agra and Lahore. Fatehpur Sikri, the city of victory, slowly emptied, its red walls left to echo with wind and the faint memory of footsteps. Akbar's later years were clouded not by foreign enemies, but by storms within his own house. Prince Salim, impatient and restless, grew into a man who chafed under the vast shadow of his father. There were whispers of heavy wine cups, of hot tempers, of rebellions that started not in distant provinces but in the heart of the royal family. One night Akbar walked alone through a nearly silent hall. The lamps burned low, their flames trembled in the faint currents of air, casting long shadows across inlaid floors. His beard was now streaked with gray, his steps slower than in his youth. He paused by a jolly window and looked out towards the darkness where Fatehpur Sikri once glowed with life. Somewhere beyond those horizons, in forts and cities he had claimed, people still prayed in many languages, to many names for God, under a sky that belonged to them all. Did I ask too much of this land, he wondered silently, or did I not give enough? Behind him, down another corridor, Prince Salim moved in his own orbit, angry, ambitious, and watched closely by courtiers with sharp eyes and sharper plans. Akbar had dreamed of an impossible empire, one that could hold difference without breaking, one that could be guided by justice more than fear. He had come closer than any before him, but even the grandest dreams must one day pass into other hands. And those hands might shape the inheritance into something gentler, or something far more troubled. In the distance, the first light of a new dawn crept over the sleeping city, touching rooftops, domes, and towers. Akbar's reign was nearing its end. Another emperor, another story, waited in that pale, rising glow. Gardens of stone, Jahangir, Nur Jahan, and Shah Jahan. When Akbar died in 1605, the empire did not fall silent. It inhaled. In the dusky light of the Agra fort, courtiers moved like shadows, robes whispering, anklets faintly chiming, messengers slipping through corridors with urgent steps. Behind carved stone screens, women wept softly. In the private chambers, princes and nobles measured one another with quick, careful glances. Power does not sleep when a great emperor dies. It shifts, like weight on a creaking ship. Prince Salim, Akbar's troubled son, stood over his father's still body. The emperor's face, once so alive with curiosity and command, was now serene, eyes closed, features softened. The scent of incense and rosewater filled the chamber, trying but failing to mask the underlying smell of sickness and sweat. Salim's own eyes were rimmed with red, some from grief, some from the long years of conflict between father and son. He had rebelled against Akbar. He had drunk too much, listened to flatterers, tried to carve out his own sphere before his time. Yet now, facing the silent figure on the bier, he felt something break inside him, not just guilt, but a sudden fear. The one man whose shadow had always loomed above him was gone. There was no one left to oppose, no one to blame. Only an empire, wide and heavy, waiting for his hand. In the days that followed, rumors crackled through the court like dry twigs in a fire. Would Salim take the throne? Would another prince try to seize it? Would powerful nobles break the fragile line of succession for their own ambitions? But Akbar, even in death, held his empire together a little longer. Many of his most trusted men chose continuity over chaos. Salim was acclaimed emperor, taking the title Nur-ud-Din Muhammad Jahangir, world Caesar. The name itself was a promise or a warning. The early days of his reign were marked by ceremony. In the Diwan-i-Am, the hall of public audience, he sat upon the throne, jewels glittering on his turban, robes heavy with embroidery. The hall smelled of sandalwood, sweat, and the faint copper tang of old blood soaked into stone from long-ago punishments. Petitioners came forward, bowing low, offering gifts and requests. Nobles lined the sides, faces careful, expressions smoothed into loyal masks. Jahangir was not his father. He did not have Akbar's tireless energy or his relentless curiosity, but he had something else, an eye for beauty, a deep love of order, and a desire, however often he failed, to be just. He listened to complaints, ordered corrupt officials punished, freed some prisoners, confirmed others in their lands and titles. He also drank. The imperial wine cups, forbidden under Akbar's more austere later years, returned to the center of evening gatherings. Ruby-colored wine swirled in crystal goblets, strong spirits flowed. The evenings in Jahangir's court were often hazy with smoke and laughter. music weaving through the air as dancers' anklets rang in time with drums and sitars. He was a man divided, part judge, part addict, part strong ruler, part drifting soul. But his story, and the story of the empire in his time, cannot be told without another name. Mahar-un-Nissa. She had entered the Mughal world long before Jahangir's eye fell fully upon her. Born to a Persian noble who had sought his fortune in Akbar's court, she grew up amid the hum of Persian poetry, the shimmer of silk, and the quiet, relentless caution of a family that had once known hardship. She married young, bore a daughter, and watched as her first husband, a soldier in imperial service, fell from grace and then from life itself. Widowed, her future seemed uncertain. Yet in the twisting corridors of the harem, where women often vanished from the pages of history, Mahar-un-Nissa's mind, grace, and presence refused to fade. She designed her own clothes with a subtle yet striking elegance. She composed verses. She counseled other women with calm insight. The scent of her perfume lingered in rooms long after she left, notes of rose, musk, and something sharper like hidden steel. When Jahangir finally noticed her not as a figure in the background but as a force in herself, it was as if a piece of his own soul had suddenly become visible. He was no young prince then, but an emperor with years already behind him, weighed down by disappointments and excess. Their connection was not immediate thunder, but a gradual, deepening gravity. Courtiers gossiped in low tones. Some said the emperor had become a puppet. Others, more honest, saw that for the first time in years Jahangir seemed to move with purpose, his gaze clearer, his decisions sharper. When he married her and bestowed upon her the title Nur Jahan, light of the world, the empire felt the shift. Nur Jahan did not rule by shouting or by brandishing swords. She ruled with ink, seal, silk, and silence. Orders went out bearing her name. Coins were minted in both their titles. She sat beside Jahangir in the Jaraka, the public balcony from which emperors showed themselves to their subjects. Her bangles chimed softly as she signed firmans, imperial decrees. Behind the delicate motions of her henna'd hand, whole cities trembled or breathed in relief. In the gardens of Kashmir, where the air was cool and the mountains stood like blue ghosts against the sky, Jahangir and Nur Jahan walked among streams and flowering beds they had ordered laid out. The sound of water over stone, the rustle of chinar leaves in the wind, the distant call of birds created a gentle orchestra. Jahangir would pause to admire a particularly rare blossom or a strange new bird. His memoirs, refined, detailed, filled with careful descriptions of plants, animals, and people, began to reflect this shared love of beauty. But in the shade of these gardens, politics still grew like thorny vines. Nur Jahan's influence made enemies. Princes worried that their own paths to power might be blocked by her family. Nobles muttered that a woman's hand lay too heavily on the empire's reins. Rebellions flickered along the edges of Mughal authority, some led or aided by Jahangir's own sons. Among those sons was Khurram, Akbar's favored grandson, Jahangir's ambitious child, who would later take the name Shah Jahan. He was brave, skilled in war, and keenly aware that his future was not guaranteed. He watched Nur Jahan with measured respect and hidden suspicion. She saw him as both asset and threat, a sharp-edged sword that could defend the empire or cut it apart. In tense gatherings, when decisions of succession and strategy were whispered behind closed doors, the air tasted bitter. Lamps burned low, throwing nervous shadows on the walls. Jahangir, fingers stained with wine, coughed more often, his once strong frame thinning. Nur Jahan's eyes shone in the dim light, clear and unwavering. Khurram, standing a little back, weighed every word, every glance. It was in this atmosphere, a mix of roses and smoke, loyalty and intrigue, that the next grate of Mughal glory and grief began to stir. In the harem, behind veils and carved stone screens, a young woman walked with quiet steps, unaware that her love story would be etched into marble, that her name, Mumtaz Mahal, would someday be spoken in 1,000 languages. And beyond the palace walls, stonecutters and architects, artisans and dreamers continued their work, never guessing what wonders their hands would one day be called to build. The gardens of the Mughal world were green and fragrant, but in their soil lay seeds of both splendor and sorrow, waiting for the reign of Shah Jahan to bloom fully, like a flower whose beauty is inseparable from the wound that created it. Shah Jahan's rise was not the clear, triumphant ascent later poetry would make it seem. Behind the carved latticework screens of the Agra and Lahore forts, the empire lived in a constant murmur, courtiers whispering, eunuchs carrying secret messages, scribes hunched over scrolls late into the night. And always, somewhere in those corridors, walked Prince Khurram, tall, sharp-eyed, deliberate in thought and step. He was Akbar's grandson, Jahangir's son, and Nur Jahan's uneasy ally. In public gatherings he bowed with perfect grace. In private, his heart beat like a war drum. The empire was vast, but succession was narrow, a single thread hanging over an abyss. Nur Jahan had her own candidate, her son-in-law. Jahangir, in his wine-clouded judgment, wavered. Khurram knew he must move carefully or lose everything. But amid that swirling storm, there was one place where he could set his armor aside. Her name was Arjman Banu Begum. The first time he saw her, the air smelled of roses and wet stone. The palace gardens had just been washed by rain, the paths darkened, the grass bright and glistening. She stood near a fountain, her reflection wavering in the rippling water. As attendants fussed with trays of flowers and incense, she looked up briefly. Their eyes met. Something quiet, deep, and immediate passed between them, like the first tremor before a great shift of earth. He was 15. She was 14, and though the empire would try to pull them apart for years, that moment carved itself into their futures. They married 5 years later in a ceremony blazing with color and music. It lasted days. Elephants adorned in gold-threaded cloths carried gifts. Drums echoed through the streets. Silk canopies were raised. Rose petals fell like rain. In the women's quarters, Arjuman's bangles chimed softly as she was led to her husband, the scent of jasmine clinging to her long after the lamps had burned low. From that day on, Shah Jahan called her Mumtaz Mahal, chosen one of the palace. And unlike so many royal marriages of convenience, theirs became something rare, a genuine partnership. She traveled with him on campaigns, advised him privately, soothed his angers, steadied his ambition. In the long evenings of tented military camps, while fires crackled outside and horses snorted in the dark, she sat beside him, her presence a calm counterweight to the empire's harsh demands. Quiet moments, shared meals, shared laughter, glittered like stars against the dark sky of politics and war. Yet no one, not even the brightest star, can escape the horizon of tragedy. In 1631, during a military campaign against rebels in the Deccan, Mumtaz Mahal went into labor in a stifling tent. The air was thick with monsoon humidity. Soldiers outside shuffled anxiously, trying to keep their torches lit as rain fell in uncertain bursts. Inside, attendants moved quickly, their faces pale with fear. Mumtaz, already weakened by many pregnancies, fought fiercely for breath and for life. Shah Jahan waited just outside the tent, the canvas walls glowing faintly from lamplight within. His hands trembled. He felt as though the earth itself were tilting. A midwife emerged, tears streaking her face. "My lord, it is done," she whispered, "but the empress she—" The rest of the sentence dissolved into the night. When Shah Jahan entered the tent, the first thing he noticed was the stillness, an unnatural, suffocating stillness. Mumtaz lay pale against the cushions, her breathing shallow, her eyes half open but already drifting beyond reach. He knelt beside her. She managed a faint smile. Her voice was barely a breath against the roar of the rain. "Promise me," she whispered, "that you will care for our children and that you will build something beautiful, something that will make the world remember our love." He pressed her hand to his forehead. "I promise." Moments later, Mumtaz Mahal slipped away, leaving behind a void that no empire could fill. Shah Jahan broke. For days he refused food. For weeks he barely spoke. Court officials tiptoed through the halls, afraid the slightest noise would shatter him completely. The empire did not halt. Empires never halt, but its heartbeat faltered. Then slowly, as the monsoon clouds thinned and the sun returned, Shah Jahan rose from his grief and turned it into purpose. He summoned architects from across Asia, masters of geometry, calligraphy, inlay, and engineering. He ordered that white marble be brought from Makrana, red sandstone from Faidehpur, turquoise from Tibet, jade from China, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, coral from the Red Sea, amber from Burma. Messenger pigeons carried sketches, elephants dragged enormous blocks of stone, ships and caravans moved like veins carrying lifeblood across the empire. On the banks of the Yamuna River, under a sky still heavy with the memory of storms, he chose the place. There, amid the scent of clay and river reeds, the Taj Mahal began to rise. Stonecutters' hammers echoed through the dawn. Chisels rang in rhythmic clatter. The air filled with marble dust, turning the sunlight soft and hazy. Thousands of workers, Persian craftsmen, Indian masons, Ottoman inlayers, calligraphers, metalworkers, labored beneath the relentless sun. At night, fires burned along the riverbank, flickering against the scaffoldings. Workers rested on rolled mats, rubbing their sore hands, staring at the silhouette of the growing structure. Some whispered that the emperor was building a palace for a ghost. Others said that even paradise would be humbled by what he created. Year after year, the monument grew. Arches unfolded like petals. Minarets stood tall and slender as prayerful fingers. Inlaid flowers, carved from stones the colors of dawn and dusk, bloomed across white marble walls. Calligraphy flowed along the gateway like dark rivers of verse. And always, in the quietest hours, Shah Jahan would come to watch. Wrapped in a shawl, his beard streaked with gray, he stood on the banks of the river and looked at the gleaming surface rising under the moonlight. "This," he would whisper, "is my promise." But promises made to the dead rarely bring peace to the living. While artisans shaped stone into poetry, shadows gathered in the empire's inner chambers. Shah Jahan's sons, Dara Shikoh, the gentle scholar, Shuja the bold, Murad the unpredictable, and Aurangzeb, disciplined, sharp, devout, each felt the pull of the future throne. Dara Shikoh walked in the gardens with books under his arm, speaking softly of unity between religions. Aurangzeb studied the Quran with uncompromising intensity, his eyes already measuring the empire with a strategist's precision. Their siblings wove alliances of their own. The scent of fresh mortar mixed with the bitter smell of suspicion. The Taj Mahal neared completion, but the Mughal dynasty began to fracture. Meanwhile, far from the river and the rising marble, whispers of a different kind of empire, leaner, hungrier, foreign, were carried by sea winds to the coastal towns. European traders built fortified warehouses, cannons gleamed on their ramparts. Their presence was small, but their ambition was vast. The world beyond the Mughal borders was shifting, and the empire's golden age, shining brilliantly under Shah Jahan's devotion to beauty, could not stop the tide that was gathering. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky bruised shades of purple and gold, Shah Jahan stood inside the nearly finished mausoleum. The huge central chamber echoed faintly with his footsteps. He placed his hand on the smooth marble railing of the cenotaph and closed his eyes. He could almost smell Mumtaz's perfume, jasmine, rose, sandalwood. Almost hear her laughter. Almost feel the warmth of her hand in his. Outside, the first stars appeared, cold and distant. Inside, Shah Jahan whispered, "I built this for you, but everything else I may lose." The Taj Mahal gleamed with eternal calm. The empire shivered with coming storms. Shah Jahan's fears were not the passing anxieties of an aging king. They were premonitions. For even as the Taj Mahal neared completion, its marble glowing like a frozen moon, its arches whispering with each step of the wind, the empire beneath it trembled with the footsteps of princes preparing for war. It began softly, like cracks hidden beneath fresh plaster, a courier who did not return, a noble whose loyalties shifted at the sound of a sweeter promise. Quiet letters sealed with wax, carried under cloaks through nighttime corridors, and at the center of it all, the growing rivalry between Dara Shikoh, Shah Jahan's favored son, and Aurangzeb, the son who refused to bend. Dara was everything his father admired: intellectual, gentle, curious. He walked through the palaces with the air of a scholar, stopping often to speak with learned men. He translated scriptures, compared them, sought meaning in unity rather than division. He kept company with Sufis, Hindu sages, and poets. To Shah Jahan, Dara seemed a reflection of Akbar's greatest ideals, the kind of ruler who might build upon the empire's beauty rather than break it. Aurangzeb was something else entirely. He rose before dawn for prayer, avoided wine, trained relentlessly, commanded troops with a rigid discipline that made even seasoned generals uneasy. His face, still young, rarely softened. His words struck like hammered iron. He respected his father, but he respected divine law more. To him, Dara's spiritual openness smelled too much like heresy, too much like weakness. Their conflict smoldered through the palace like a slow-moving fire. One night in the Hall of Mirrors of the Red Fort, Dara walked alone. The ceiling shimmered with hundreds of tiny reflections from the oil lamps, making the space look as if the stars themselves had descended to witness his steps. The air smelled of warm metal, wax, and distant sandalwood. A trusted advisor approached him quietly. "Prince, your brothers prepare. Their armies grow. Their eyes are set upon the throne." Dara stopped, his reflection breaking into 1,000 fragments across the mirrored walls. "I want no civil war," he said softly. "Wanting will not prevent it," the advisor whispered. "Your father weakens. When he falls ill, the empire will choose, and so will your brother's blades." Dara closed his eyes, the weight settling around him. Outside, unseen, Aurangzeb knelt in prayer on a rugged mat, his forehead touching the cold marble, his lips moving silently. Victory belongs to the righteous. And soon the storm came. In 1657, Shah Jahan fell gravely ill. His chambers filled with the heavy scent of medicinal herbs, cloves, crushed rose petals, ground ambergris. Physicians hovered like crows, mixing potions, checking his pulse, whispering to each other nervously. The emperor's face turned pale, his once powerful frame reduced to trembling weakness. Word spread quickly. The peacock throne is slipping from its master's hands. Across the empire, the princes moved. Shuja declared himself emperor in Bengal. Murad did the same in Gujarat. Aurangzeb marched out with cold efficiency. Dara struggled to maintain order in Agra, torn between tending to his father and rallying armies. Courtiers fled to whichever prince they thought most likely to win. Drums rolled in the distance. Messengers rode day and night, their horses collapsing from exhaustion at palace gates. Then, against all expectation, Shah Jahan recovered. The lamps in his chamber burned brighter. His voice returned, softer but steady. He called for Dara, grasping his son's hand with trembling fingers. "My throne is yours," he whispered. But by then, the empire had already slipped into the jaws of war. Aurangzeb moved quickly, decisively. He defeated Shuja. He forged a temporary alliance with Murad, then betrayed him and imprisoned him. And finally, he turned toward Dara. The decisive battle took place near Samugar. The air that morning was thick with heat, the sun rising like a blade of fire. Dara rode at the head of his troops, his face lined with worry but lit with determination. His armor gleamed, but his heart was heavy. He did not want to fight his brother. Aurangzeb rode out in stark contrast. Plain armor, plain horse, plain banners. Nothing excessive, everything purposeful. His soldiers stood in disciplined lines, muskets ready, cannons positioned with precision. The clash was violent. Cannons roared. Dust swallowed the sky. Elephants screamed. Steel met steel in devastating arcs. By dusk, Dara's lines broke. His standard fell. He fled, heart shattering with every hoofbeat. Aurangzeb marched into Agra like a man fulfilling grim destiny. Shah Jahan, horrified and helpless, attempted to negotiate, but the doors of his own chambers shut against him. Aurangzeb imprisoned his father in the octagonal tower of the Agra fort, a chamber overlooking the Taj Mahal. There, for the rest of his life, Shah Jahan gazed at the white marble tomb he had built for his love. Each evening, the setting sun turned it golden. Each night, the moon washed it in silver. And the man who built it watched in silence, the empire slipping beyond his reach. Mumtaz Mahal's monument remained perfect, eternal. The world around it fractured. Dara was captured and killed, his head sent to Aurangzeb as proof. The court fell under strict order. Nur Jahan died, quiet and forgotten by politics, remembered only by poetry and the fading scent of her once great perfumes. And in the quiet of his confinement, Shah Jahan whispered the story of his love to whoever would listen. Attendants, guards, silent walls. Outside, the winds that swept along the Yamuna carried the faint scent of jasmine from the gardens of the Taj. Inside, the fallen emperor felt both closer to his beloved than ever, and farther from the empire he once ruled. The age of marble and poetry had ended. The age of thorns was beginning. Aurangzeb, the emperor of thorns. The night around the imperial war tent was thick and humid, a blanket of warm darkness draped over a weary army. The small lamps strung between the guy ropes swayed in a faint wind, their flames trembling. Beyond them, the camp stretched out like a restless city. Rows of canvas, silhouettes of horses, the glow of scattered fires where soldiers sat in tight circles, murmuring over flatbread and watered milk. Steel glinted here and there where blades were being checked, sharpened, or simply held, as if metal alone could keep fear away. Inside the largest tent, Aurangzeb Alamgir knelt in silence. The ground beneath his prayer mat was hard, pressed flat by countless steps, but he did not shift or fidget. His forehead touched the woven fibers. The only sounds were his quiet recitation and the faint rustle of his cotton robe when he moved between postures. No jeweled rings glittered on his fingers. No silk cushions surrounded him. For a man who now ruled one of the richest empires on earth, his surroundings were almost austere. When he finally rose, he did so with measured slowness. His face, lined by years of war and rule, was set in its usual calm severity. The lamps cast soft shadows across his cheekbones, emphasizing the sharpness of his gaze. This was not the prince who had once bent over his books as a boy. This was the emperor who had outmaneuvered all his brothers, outweighted his father, and now outlasted most of his enemies. But the empire he had inherited was not the one his ancestors had built. It was larger and more brittle. A general stepped in through the tent flap, bowing low. The heavy canvas whispered as it fell closed behind him. Alamgir, he said, using the title Aurangzeb had chosen, World Caesar. The reports from the Deccan have arrived. The Deccan. The word itself seemed to burden the air. The rugged plateau to the south had been a thorn in Mughal flesh for decades, a land of proud sultanates and rising Maratha power. Under Aurangzeb, the empire's reach had extended deeper than ever into those territories, but the deeper they reached, the more the land resisted. Aurangzeb took the scroll and unrolled it slowly. His eyes moved over the lines. More fortresses captured, more rebellions, more supplies needed, more raids by Maratha horsemen who struck like lightning and vanished into the hills. He read without flinching, without sighing, without the dramatic gestures of some rulers. When he finished, he rolled the scroll again and placed it aside. "Tell them to hold," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that no one present could ignore. Reinforcements will be sent. The Deccan will be subdued. The general hesitated, then bowed again and withdrew. Left alone, Aurangzeb walked to the edge of the tent and lifted the flap slightly. Outside, the camp shimmered under the faint light of a crescent moon. Somewhere, a soldier laughed at a joke too loud for this. Late hour, then fell abruptly silent when a superior hissed a warning. A horse snorted and tugged at its tether. Aurangzeb's mind wandered, uninvited, back to another time. He saw himself as a young prince standing before his father, Shah Jahan, in the splendor of the Red Fort. Sunlight poured through jolly screens, turning dust into drifting gold. The air had smelled of adder ink and polished wood. Dara Shikoh stood nearby, wrapped in softly colored robes, a book in his hand, eyes bright with thoughts of unity and mystic truths. In that remembered hall, their father's voice rang out. "My sons, you will one day carry this empire further than I have." Dara had smiled, seeing a future of learning and spiritual bridges. Aurangzeb had bowed, seeing a future of order, law, and iron. Now, years later, one of them was a ghost. The other bore the title of Alamgir. Aurangzeb let the tent flap fall, shutting out the night. He knew what people said of him, even if they dared not say it within earshot, that he was too harsh, too rigid, that where Akbar had opened doors, he was closing them, that his policies favored some subjects and alienated others. He had reimposed the jizya tax. He had ordered the destruction or closure of some temples, especially where he believed they were centers of political resistance. He had banned some of the more exuberant practices at court. Music became rarer, wine was outlawed, festivals simplified. In his view, he was purifying a decaying structure, scraping away the painted excess to reveal clean, strong lines beneath. But he also knew that each command signed in careful ink sent ripples across the land, ripples that sometimes returned as storms. In a town hundreds of miles away, a temple courtyard stood silent where it had once echoed with bells. The stone idols, now removed or covered, left pale marks where worshippers used to place garlands. The people still murmured their prayers, but more quietly now, their eyes always alert to the sound of approaching boots. In another place, a mosque rose newly built, its minaret pointing like a spear at the sky. The call to prayer cut through dawn, its melody clear and commanding. Those who had longed for stricter adherence to religious law smiled and bowed their heads. Those who feared division folded their worries deeper into their hearts. In the markets, merchants counted their coins and shrugged. Power changed, policies shifted, trade went on. But even their shrugging could not fully mask the unease edging into conversations. Under Aurangzeb, the empire spread wider than ever, its borders swelling like a great lung taking in one last full breath. But breath requires effort, and the effort was immense. Years of war in the Deccan drained the treasury and the spirit of the troops. Fort after fort was besieged, captured, lost, retaken. Villages were burned and rebuilt. Fields were trampled and replanted. For every rebel crushed, another seemed to rise from the dust. Yet Aurangzeb refused to step back. He moved his entire court to the south, spending the later years of his reign far from the grand northern cities his ancestors had adorned. Tents replaced marble halls. War councils replaced leisurely poetic gatherings. The smell of gunpowder and horse sweat replaced the scent of garden blossoms. In one long campaign season, as rain hammered on tent roofs and turned roads into rivers of mud, an old commander approached him. "Alamgir," the man said carefully, "the empire is vast. The north needs your presence as much as the south. These wars cannot last forever." Aurangzeb, sitting on a plain wooden chair, fingers resting on a rolled carpet instead of a jeweled armrest, looked up slowly. "Do you suggest," he asked, "that I leave my duty unfinished, that I let rebels carve the empire to pieces for the sake of comfort?" The commander swallowed. I suggest only that a bow kept always drawn will someday snap, my lord." Aurangzeb's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Fatigue, perhaps, or a quiet, relentless sadness he would never confess. "A just ruler," he replied, "dies with the bow in his hand." Outside, thunder rumbled across the sky. In that moment, the fate of the Mughal Empire did not change. The cracks had been forming long before, and would have continued either way. But the line between repair and overstrain grew thinner. The emperor prayed. The emperor fought. The emperor wrote letters in his own hand, counting every coin, measuring every decision by the yardstick of duty. But duty, like ambition, can be a blade that cuts both ways. Beyond the circle of his campfires, men in the hills whispered the names of new leaders, Maratha chiefs who rode hard and fast, who knew every fold of the land, who refused to bow. In the far corners of the empire, tribal chieftains, zamindars, and minor kings tested the limits of obedience, pushing back when they sensed the center's attention was stretched too thin. And in the Qui, at rooms of distant European trading posts, men in foreign coats bent over maps of India, their fingertips tracing coastlines, rivers, and cities that the Mughals thought of as their unquestioned domain. The world was shifting. Aurangzeb held on. But every prayer, every campaign, every decree signed by flickering lamplight brought him closer to the one truth no emperor can escape, that his time, too, would end, and what he left behind might not be what he intended. Outside, a muezzin's voice rose in the pre-dawn darkness, calling the faithful to prayer. Inside, Aurangzeb closed his eyes and whispered words he had known since he was a boy, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, how many of his subjects now whispered their own, very different prayers about the future of the realm. Age crept into Aurangzeb's camp the way mist creeps over a battlefield after the fighting stops, softly, without announcement, but impossible to ignore once it settles. The emperor's beard turned white at the edges. His back, once straight as a spear, bent slightly. Yet he refused golden litters and jeweled thrones. He rode for hours, slept on thin bedding, ate spare meals. His tent, compared to those of his officers, was almost bare. A low bed, a desk with papers stacked in careful order, a few Qurans, a worn rosary of wooden beads. At night, when the camp grew quiet, he wrote letters. Not the grand, dictation-heavy farmans of imperial command, but private notes in his own hand, ink-staining fingers that had grown thinner with time. His handwriting, precise and neat, carried both strength and a strange, buried sorrow. In one letter to a daughter, he wrote of his worries about the state of the empire, of the unruly nobles, of the treacherous sons who would inherit his world. In another, he confessed, though cautiously, that he had known little joy in life, that rule had weighed on him like a chain. He dictated accounts of revenue and expenses as if they were verses, each number a moral question. Had he spent too much on war, too little on mercy? The sounds of the camp drifted in through the tent walls, the coughs of soldiers, the clink of armor being set aside, the bray of a restless mule. Outside, lightning sometimes flashed over distant hills, briefly illuminating rows of sleeping men who would rise tomorrow to fight for reasons many of them did not fully understand. The Deccan Wars dragged on. Fort after fort fell, but no final peace emerged. It was as if the land itself refused to lie still under the imperial banner. Maratha horsemen, led by men like Sambhaji and later by hard-riding generals, struck supply lines, raided wealthy towns, then vanished into scrub forests and rocky defiles. Aurangzeb pursued them relentlessly, his armies spreading over the south like a vast, grinding machine. But machines consume fuel. The empire's fuel was silver, grain, and flesh. Tax collectors pressed harder on peasants already dizzy from past demands. Fields once vibrant with green crops lay scorched after marching armies passed. Villagers who had never seen the Red Fort or the Taj Mahal, who had only a vague idea of what emperor even meant, now felt its presence as hunger and conscription. In the north, governors grew more independent, their loyalty thinner as the emperor's eye remained fixed on the distant Deccan. In Bengal, in the Punjab, in Rajputana, men who might once have trembled at the thought of disobedience began to measure the risks differently. If the center was always far away, perhaps the edges could begin to think for themselves. Yet to Aurangzeb, leaving the south unfinished was unthinkable. One evening, as rain hammered the canvas so hard it sounded like an army of drummers, his eldest surviving son, Prince Azam, stepped into the imperial tent. Water dripped from his cloak, forming small dark circles on the carpet. "Father," Azam began, "the men are tired, the treasury it groans. The nobles whisper, the zamindars strain. Must we go on like this?" Aurangzeb looked at him, eyes dim but sharp. "Do you think," he asked, "that one may leave a wound half-healed? It will fester, it will poison the whole body." "But if the treatment kills the body first?" Azam asked quietly. For a long moment only the rain replied. It battered the tent, ran in narrow streams through the camp, soaked the banners, filled the hoofprints of exhausted horses. Aurangzeb finally turned away. "We will do what is required," he said. His voice was steady, but it held the weariness of a man who has given the same answer too many times. Years folded into each other. Seasons passed. Monsoon mud, winter chill, the brief shock of spring flowers, the scorch of summer sun. Sons rebelled and were crushed. Trusted commanders died. New names rose and fell with a speed that made even the court historians struggle to keep up. In 1707, near the town of Ahmednagar, Aurangzeb's body finally admitted what his will had long denied. Illness began like a whisper, a fever that did not break, a weakness in his hands as he tried to lift them in prayer. Physicians brought potions and poultices, their faces carefully neutral. In his tent, the lamps burned lower, their light softer, as if the world itself were dimming around him. He called for his son. He called for paper. He called for God. In one of his last letters, he wrote, "I came alone and I go as a stranger. I know not who I am, nor what I have been doing." The words, simple and unadorned, might have come from any tired old man at the end of his road. Yet this tired old man had commanded armies that shook a continent, signed decrees that shaped millions of lives, and stretched his realm further than any Mughal before him. Now he asked for a simple grave. No domes. No marble. No inlay. He wanted to be buried in the earth, covered only by a sheet of white cloth, in the courtyard of a modest shrine at Kuldabad. And so it was. The emperor who had ruled under a canopy of thorns chose to lie down under open sky. When news of his death spread, the empire did not collapse in a single thunderclap. It sagged, it loosened, it exhaled in uneven breaths. In the Red Fort at Delhi, the peacock throne still glittered with diamonds and rubies. Courtiers still bowed, drums still beat, but something invisible had broken. The iron hand that had held the realm together too tightly, many would later say, was gone. His heirs were less disciplined, less feared, more divided. In the bazaars of distant cities, merchants carried on counting coins, but they glanced more often at the horizon. In fortresses and princely courts, men began to ask themselves dangerous questions. What if the emperors will no longer reach this far? What if we claimed more for ourselves? And far away in the offices of European trading companies, men in powdered wigs and ink-stained cuffs unfolded maps of India and saw not a single, unassailable empire, but a mosaic of powers, some fading, some rising, all vulnerable. The line of Babur, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb had not yet ended, but its light, once a steady blaze, flickered now, thin and uncertain. In Delhi, the Red Fort waited, its walls still echoing with the footsteps of emperors. Soon those halls would hear new sounds, boots that did not belong to Mughals, trials instead of coronations, laments instead of victory songs. The empire of marble and fire was tilting toward its final dusk. Ashes in the Red Fort. The Red Fort of Delhi rises like a wounded lion against the horizon, its sandstone walls still bold, still proud, but softened at the edges by time, by rain, by the slow erosion of purpose. In the early morning, mist gathers along its ramparts, a thin veil clinging to the Mughal emblem carved above the Lahore gate. The sun pushes through the haze in pale streaks, illuminating domes that once gleamed with imperial power. Inside, the air carries the faint scent of dust and old incense, the smell of a place that remembers more than it reveals. Footsteps echo in corridors where emperors once moved with armies at their command. The Mughal Empire is no longer the thunderous force it had been under Akbar or Shah Jahan or Aurangzeb. It has thinned to a frail thread, held together by tradition, by poetry, and by the stubborn endurance of a name that still clings to dignity. The year is 1857, but the unraveling began long before. After Aurangzeb's death, the empire fractured like a mirror dropped from great height. The pieces did not shatter all at once. They cracked slowly, almost gracefully, as if reluctant to admit the break. His heirs fought among themselves, suspicious and small-minded, lacking the discipline that had held the realm together. In the south, Marathas rose like a monsoon storm, swift, powerful, relentless. Their cavalry swept across plains and forests, reclaiming territories once taken from them. In the north, Rajputs asserted independence. In Bengal, Nawabs strengthened their hold, governing in all but name. The Sikhs carved out a rising power in the Punjab. Governors, sensing weakness in the center, held back revenue, built private armies, and began acting as rulers in their own right. And along the coasts, a new kind of power, one that did not speak Persian, did not bow in darbars, did not ride elephants or recite court poetry, slowly tightened its grip. The British East India Company arrived first as traders, then as negotiators, then as intermediaries, then as masters. Their ships brought spices, silver, guns. Their clerks brought treaties, ledgers, and a different rhythm of rule, cold, calculating, mercantile. They were patient, they were ruthless, and most importantly, they did not leave. The Mughals watched their world shrink. Palace servants whispered of new laws issued by men who sat in distant offices. Nobles, once bloated with privilege, now negotiated with company officials as if begging for scraps. Emperor after emperor was crowned, but each one held less land, less wealth, and less authority than the one before. By the time Bahadur Shah II, known to history as Bahadur Shah Zafar, took the throne in 1837, the Mughal Empire had become a ghost of itself. His realm extended little beyond the walls of Delhi. The peacock throne was gone, taken by Persian invaders long ago. The imperial treasury was bare. The emperor received a pension from the British officers who effectively ruled India. Yet Zafar was no empty figure. He was a poet, a dreamer, a man who carried centuries of imperial memory in the lines of his palm. His court, though modest, still flickered with echoes of the old Mughal grandeur. Musharas where poets recited verses until dawn, gatherings where musicians plucked sitar strings that shimmered in the air like delicate threads, evenings perfumed with rosewater and lit by oil lamps glowing in niches carved centuries before. Zafar's verses carried a soft melancholy. Lakta nahin hai dil mera ujr dayar main. Dil dekhte hun Zafar, ashana ho gaya. My heart no longer finds rest in this ruined homeland. And as I gaze upon myself, Zafar, I see how helpless I have become. But even poetry could not hold back the tide that was rising in the streets of India. In 1857, the first sparks came from Meerut. A mutiny, a rumor of cartridges greased with cow and pig fat, an insult to Hindu and Muslim soldiers alike. A clash with British officers, a burst of anger long held back by fear. The sepoys marched to Delhi, shouting for justice, for honor, for rebellion. As they entered the old Mughal capital, thousands of Delhi's citizens poured into the streets in a wild, uncertain frenzy. Banners rose, slogans echoed, doors slammed open, footsteps thundered over ancient stones. And all voices, thousands of voices, cried the same name. Zafar! 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 The aging emperor, startled, afraid, and yet strangely resolute, stepped forward. The sepoys begged him to lead them, to become the symbolic head of an uprising against British rule. Zafar hesitated. The years had worn him thin. The empire had shrunk to a shadow. The British still stood strong across India. But as he looked out over the gathering crowd, their faces lit with desperate hope, something inside him stirred. A memory, a lineage. The echo of Babur's victory, Akbar's justice, Jahangir's gardens, Shah Jahan's marble dreams. He agreed. And for the first time in over a century, the Red Fort's halls trembled with the sound of an emperor lifting his head. But hope is a fragile fire. The rebellion burned fiercely at first, but it lacked coordination, support, and unified leadership. British reinforcements surged. Battles turned bloody. Whole neighborhoods in Delhi vanished under cannon fire. Streets ran with ash and despair. Zafar, who had never wished for war, now found himself carrying the unbearable weight of it. He walked slowly through the fort's mirrored halls, listening to the distant thunder of artillery. The lamps flickered. Smoke seeped into the air. His poets fell silent. His family hid in fear. The empire felt like a dying animal in his arms. When the British finally retook Delhi, their fury was merciless. Prisoners were shot without trial. Homes were burned. Temples and mosques were desecrated. Heads of rebels were mounted on spikes. Zafar fled to the tomb of Humayun, seeking sanctuary, but was captured. British soldiers surrounded him, bayonets gleaming, uniforms stiff, faces set in cold lines. They brought him back to the Red Fort, not as a king but as a criminal. Courtroom not court. Accusation not poetry. Chains not jewels. The trial was swift, a performance of legality that masked a verdict already decided. Zafar stood before his conquerors with trembling hands, his long beard streaked with white, his eyes hollow from grief. He listened as he was accused of treason against an empire not his own, of leading a rebellion he had tried to contain, of crimes committed by men he did not command. His voice, when it came, was soft and tired. "I am only a poet," he said. "A poet, and the last ember of something once vast." The British exiled him to Rangoon. As he left Delhi, he looked back from the ramparts of the Red Fort. The city stretched before him, scarred, silent, dust settling in the streets. He whispered a final couplet to the wind. "Kitna badnasib hun Zafar, dafin ki le. Du gaz zamin by, na mili kui yar main." How unfortunate is Zafar! That for burial, he did not receive even 2 yards of earth in his beloved land. In Burma, in a small, lonely house with peeling paint and empty rooms, Bahadur Shah Zafar spent his final days writing poetry on scraps of paper, staring out at a foreign sky. Scenes of Delhi haunted him, arches of red sandstone, the Yamuna's slow bend, the evening call to prayer drifting across rooftops. He died far from home. His grave, simple and unadorned, rests in a quiet corner of Rangoon, a place no Mughal emperor before him could have named. And so the last flicker of Mughal flame went out. But the empire did not vanish. Not truly. Its marble still gleams in moonlight. Its forts still rise against the sun. Its gardens still breathe with fountains and cypresses. Its architecture still crowns India with domes and arches that whisper old stories. And its cultural legacy, its poetry, its cuisine, its music, its fusion of worlds, still pulses in the heartbeats of millions. Empires die, but their echoes linger. sometimes in stone, sometimes in songs, sometimes in memories carried by poets. The Mughal Empire burned bright, then burned out, its ashes settling into the cracks of history. Yet if you walk through Delhi at dawn, when the sky is still soft and the streets still quiet, you can hear something faint in the air. The rustle of a royal robe, the distant hum of kettle drums, the whisper of a language once spoken in marble halls, the sigh of an emperor watching the sun rise over a world he could not keep. The story ends, but the echo remains, carried by wind, held by stone, kept alive by the people who still walk where emperors once dreamed.